Right, so we're opening up on our second presentation at the World Astrology Summit. We have STA tutor Eve Dembowski here to talk about pandemics and the great conjunctions of Saturn and Jupiter and how these are all bound up in each other. Eve, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to you. How would you like questions? Would you like me to alert you when questions come up in the chat box? Do you want to pause for questions?
Yeah, probably just alert me if a question comes in. And yeah, we'll just see, just play it by ear. We'll just kind of wing it.
All right, sounds good.
Okay. All right. So thank you very much for inviting me to be part of this. And so today I'm going to be looking at pandemics and the great conjunction of Saturn and Jupiter. Now, I have to say that my initial inspiration for this was, of course, as it probably is for everybody, COVID and what happened, and the fact that, you know, we had the Saturn-Jupiter conjunction in the year of COVID. But we're going to go back a little bit, and I'm going to start kind of at the beginning, because I have to be really honest and say that I went down so many rabbit holes doing the research for this that I probably, you know, I learned a huge amount that is never going to make it into this particular presentation. So first of all, I want to start with a couple quotes. This is from André Barbeau, who says, being at the heart of the solar system, we live according to the duration of astral time with its cyclical rhythms. And Charles Harvey, who says the chart for the beginning of any cycle contains within it all that will subsequently unfold in time. Now, obviously, these are not things that any of us would be unaware of, as we're all astrologers here. And as William Lilly said, astrologers are artists, and our canvas is time. We work with moments, and the word moment implies movement. It comes directly from the Latin momentum, meaning movement, motion, moving power, alteration, and change. Time itself is immaterial. Time itself cannot really be defined. We can't touch it or see it. We know it because we experience it, and we record it in our memory. Movement is the evidence as well as the measure of time. And as astrologers, of course, we use the cycle of the planets to define time periods. Periods of time are then made up of a series of moments, and oftentimes smaller periods of time within them. Now, some moments have far more importance than others. Of course, no moment is isolated, and no planetary cycle stands alone. So an astrological chart that we work with is a crystallized moment, or represents a crystallized moment grounded by location. And it's the location of a chart that gives that moment order and significance. All astrological charts will represent one moment that has importance within some sort of particular context or purpose. And that moment sits within a time frame. We might work with moments, but they all exist within a time frame. And when we're looking at mundane astrology, we're talking about broad time frames defined by slow planetary cycles. The quality of these broad time periods act as a foundation to smaller time periods and many, many moments, which can be looked at through ingresses and eclipses, foundational charts, and all sorts of other things. The natal chart is a defined time frame of a lifetime. And of course, that life is made up of many, many shorter overlapping periods of time and minutiae moments of importance, some of which are regular, like a solar return, which is going to be important and regularly return at the right, you know, the time that we know of, and others might come out of nowhere. They're kind of accidentally important. And of course, horary or electional astrology deals with extremely narrow time frames, like a little tiny sliver of time. But that little sliver of time sits on top of or above broader time periods. So the smaller the time frame, the more focus and detail we can see. As we pan out from this very small, narrow perspective to a larger time frame, the details start to get blurrier and the boundaries more difficult to identify. It's a bit like, you know, enlarging a photo, and you start to lose some of the details. Now, this brings us to the great conjunction, the cycle of Saturn and Jupiter, which before the discovery of the modern outer planets, this was the grandest cycle of all. it begins, of course, at the conjunction, which was known as the Great Conjunction, which happens every 20 years. Successive conjunctions occurred nearly 120 years apart in the same triplicity for approximately 10 to 12 cycles before shifting into the next triplicity, an event that was referred to as the mutation, thus forming a grand cycle through all 4 triplicities. Now, medieval astrologers used the mean position of the conjunction and were particularly interested in the times of the mutation or elemental shift. Now, based on an idealized cycle that uses the average length of each planet's journey through the zodiac, that is 12 years for Jupiter and 29 and a half for Saturn, the mean conjunctions occurred at precise and very regular intervals, resulting in a clean elemental mutations. They would go from one element to the next. So within this grand cycle, we have 3 cycles or time frames that are created: the conjunction cycle of 20 years, the mutation cycle of 240 years, and the grand cycle of 960 years. And I remember learning this when I was a baby astrologer, and I learned this in, I can't remember what book, and I was amazed at how, astrology was so wonderful. It was so regular, and wow, this 960 years, and you divide it by 4 and you get 240, which is 12 times 20. Isn't that wonderful? Yeah. However, the mean position really simplifies a much more complex cycle in which the actual position of the conjunctions and their shift into new elements are much messier. The grand cycle through all 4 of the elements is really much closer to 800 years in duration. The mutation can actually take up to 80 years to complete, because it might make a conjunction in a new element and then it'll go back to the old one. Sometimes it makes 2 conjunctions in a new element and then flips back to the original one before going back to the new one and kind of committing itself to it. So the period between conjunctions is approximately 20 years. And of course, due to retrogression, we might get some conjunctions that occur 3 times within a matter of months. So we're using, the mean positions were used because it was difficult to know precisely when the moment of the conjunction would occur. Therefore, other charts were used to evaluate the conjunction periods. And what we can sort of say is that the element that the conjunction occurs in acts kind of like an imprimatura, and I may not be pronouncing that word correctly. And that is an undertone that influences the quality of that time period, lasting up to 200 plus years. And the sign that the conjunction occurs in would color the 20-year period. So I'm going to be using the actual position of the conjunctions for this presentation. So I'm not using the mean positions. So what does it actually mean when you have Jupiter and Saturn coming together? And this is really important, because to try and understand this, we need to understand what this might possibly mean. I have a colleague who sort of said, well, Jupiter and Saturn conjunction, it's like the battle of the Titans. You had the 2 biggies coming together. And according to Andre Barbeau, the nature of the phenomenon, the cycle, is dictated by the characteristics of the 2 planets involved in the cycle and the sign of the zodiac against which the conjunction takes place. So, of course, we think of Jupiter as the great benefic, tending towards tolerance and goodwill, bestowing lots of good stuff on us. But, he does have a dark side. Jupiter does come with a certain exaggerated moral certainty, a certain exaggerated belief or philosophical arrogance, and it can lead to somewhat being religiously dogmatic or intolerant. Saturn, on the other hand, the great malefic, we know Saturn is a hard taskmaster. We don't like Saturn because he imposes restriction and control. And, ultimately, he brings death because that's his job. He's going to stop life. We're all going to die, and we're going to meet Saturn. So whilst he can be very intolerant, he's also protectionist. And in some ways, his job or his character is to seek structure, order, in order to bring security. So when they come into conjunction, this is an interaction that can be very interesting. It's an interaction between ideas and potential possibilities, all the Jupiter stuff, and also the viability of any of their manifestation in concrete material world. So how does this behave in the different elements? Now, I'm really only going to look in detail at the air element and then whip through the others and get into the pandemics, because that's where all the good stuff is. So if we think about the air element and we think about themes that, the conjunction in air might bring, well, any theme to do with air, ideas, information, communication, travel, trade, making deals, any kind of social interaction, relationships, that's all air stuff. Now, from a disease or health perspective, air is hot and moist. It deals with the sanguine humor. So blood and respiratory problems might be imagined, or you might think about this. But there's also something else, the contagious airborne viruses and germs, because hot, moist, it goes out there, it's moist, it gets everywhere. So the idea of a contagious disease seems very logical in air. Now, Jupiter, it is interesting to look at because Jupiter is, a hot, moist planet. He has no rulership, or except the mixed triplicity rulership of air signs. But, between all of us, really, the mixed triplicity rulership, it's such a minor thing. A lot of times we don't use it. So, Jupiter probably feels a bit gypped that way. And he actually finds his detriment in Gemini, and Aquarius is the 12th sign from Pisces. So he doesn't particularly like Aquarius. So he's not that happy in air, ironically. And really, if you think about it, when a planet's not very happy, it's going to misbehave. So Jupiter's hot, moist nature is going to be exaggerated, which is part of Jupiter's nature, is to exaggerate. So he's going to be an exaggerated version of his exaggerated self. So we could see this as an imbalance of excess of hot, moist. Now, Saturn, on the other hand, he rules and rejoices in Aquarius. He's exalted in Libra. He has triplicity rule over the air signs by day. He loves being in air. Now, Saturn's extreme cold, dry nature is tempered by being in the hot, moist air. So we can assume that the periods in which Saturn and Jupiter meet in the air element will generally be dominated by Saturn's character, but probably his more, in some ways, tempered character. He's still going to want to set boundaries and create rules and do all that Saturn stuff, which a lot of people don't like. The problem is he's going to have to contend with a Jupiter that is going to be a little bit out of control. This excess of hot, moist may result in Jupiter's natural philosophical nature being corrupted and his darker side manifesting. As I thought when I was thinking about this, is like too much hot air, overly confident, too many grand ideas, dogma, opinions, some of which lack facts. Just think about where we're at the moment, and this might make sense. Okay, now the earth element, Jupiter has no rulership, and in fact, he's in detriment in Virgo and fall in Capricorn. So he really is not comfortable in earth. So we would imagine seeing a more negative side of Jupiter during these earth conjunctions. But this is going to be a different side. This is going to be more about physical material stuff. So Jupiter's overdoing things, more is best, accumulation, hoarding, love of money, wealth. And the diseases that are of the cold, dry nature might be digestive type diseases. It's interesting to look at the birth of the capitalist system in the late 18th century, just as the conjunctions went into Earth. Saturn, on the other hand, is, not so unhappy in Earth. He loves, he's rules Capricorn, so he's okay in Earth. And so we could imagine that these periods will be dominated again by Saturn's manifesting character, and possibly the negative side of Jupiter. In the water element, Jupiter is much happier. Jupiter rules Pisces, finds his exaltation in Cancer, so he's a happy chappy in water. Saturn, on the other hand, not so much. He's in detriment in Cancer and doesn't have any kind of rulership or anything. So the periods of the water conjunctions are probably going to be dominated more by Jupiter's character, with some resistance from a frustrated Saturn. I would just surmise here, as far as disease and stuff, that we might see fertility kind of problems. It is interesting. Well, I'll get into that when I get into the pandemics. And then the fire element, again, Jupiter rules and rejoices in Sagittarius, and he's got triplicity rule over the fire signs by night. Saturn, again, only mixed triplicity in fire, so not really much. And he's in detriment in Leo, falls in Aries, and Sagittarius is the 12th sign from Capricorn. So I would say that the periods of fire element will be dominated by Jupiter's character. So we could see a lot of, ideology and, spiritual, religious sort of thing in both water and in the fire elements. I think this is very much the case. It is interesting that both Islam and the Protestant church were born during water conjunctions. Okay, so this basically brings it down to Jupiter's happiest in water and fire, and at a disadvantage in air and earth, whereas Saturn is happiest in air and also earth, and disadvantage in water and fire. So how does this relate to pandemics? Well, we're going to find out. So basically, no pandemic occurs in a vacuum. An epidemic is a symptom of imbalance and breakdowns in a system, in a local environment. And a pandemic occurs when that breakdown is extended beyond the boundaries of locality. Now, imbalances occur for all sorts of reasons, from natural to manufactured ones. Natural disasters, climate change, but it could also be political, religious corruption, desire for power, conflict, war. And when you start to think about it, if you have a war, you're going to have economic disparity, you're going to have unsanitary conditions, you're going to have degradation or neglect of the environment. You're going to, one thing leads to another. So imbalances can occur for many, many different reasons. I do absolutely love this, this quote from Albert Camus in his novel, The Plague, that says, "But what does it mean, the plague? It's life, that's all." So let us continue on. The plague. So I'm not going to look in detail at the astrology of the plague. The plague was a disease that killed millions and millions of people. And it was finally found in 1894 to have been caused by the bacterium called Yersinia pestis. And there's a few strands of it. Now, of course, there's a lot of information here, and I don't have time to go through all of it. But what I'd like to do is to look at the beginning of this plague and look at the pre-Saturn-Jupiter conjunction at which it started. So it's like the beginning point. So the Justinian plague began in 541 and went for about 200 years till the mid-700s. And basically, it is said that between 30 and 50 million people died during that period. Now, after the first wave, where there were many, many deaths, it kind of died back. And then every 10 to 12 years, it would come back somewhere else. So the pre-Jupiter conjunction in 531, so that was almost 10 years before, was at 19 Gemini. And what needs to be understood is that in 536, there was a series of, volcanic explosions that occurred very close to each other and created a volcanic winter. And the reports of eyewitnesses at the time say that for 18 months, the sun did not shine. So this caused crop failure and all sorts of other things. Now, I didn't read anything about famines, but I would imagine that people were, kind of hungry, and they might have lost a bit of weight during this time and been weakened. And then 6 years later, in comes, in Constantinople, in comes the plague through, a ship from Egypt. And so the important thing to remember is that 19 Gemini is when it began. It then mutated into the water conjunctions, but it seemed to have died back around the mid-700s. And there was a mutation into fire in 769. Now, when the Justinian plague arrived in Europe, it was at the opposition of Saturn and Jupiter. So fast forward a few hundred years later, we have the Black Plague. And that occurred, it arrived in Europe in 1347, but they say it probably started around 1338. So if we're looking at the 1338 for in Asia, the pre-Saturn Jupiter conjunction was in 1325 at 18 Gemini. And when it finally arrived into Europe, this time through Messina in Italy, the pre-conjunction was at 19 Aquarius. So notice we've come full circle. We have completed a grand cycle from 19 Gemini to 18 Gemini. We're back there. So a grand cycle has been completed, and bang, we have the plague come back. There was also a triple conjunction of Mars, Saturn, and Jupiter in 1345 at 17 Aquarius, which of course, most of the astrologers of the day put a lot of focus on this, saying this was, you know, this evil triple conjunction was what brought this great Black Death to their world. Now, there was a third plague, which started in 1855, and that pre-Saturn-Jupiter conjunction was in 1842 at 8 Capricorn. This one was quite different in many ways, though it is said that it was started by this, you know, caused by the same bacterium. It was much slower. It didn't seem as contagious, and people took longer to die. So there was some differences. It's in Earth as opposed to air. So let me go on. I mean, there's a lot that I could say, but I want to get through a lot of material, so I want to keep going. So other pandemics, and what I did was I tried to focus on the ones that were the biggies, you know, because of course there's always diseases and things happening. So what we're looking for is those big ones. So there was the New World smallpox pandemic. And I mean, this one was horrible. I didn't have a chance to really go into detail with this one, but some of the reports I've read that up to 90% of the indigenous population died of this smallpox pandemic that occurred between 1520 and 1600. So the pre-conjunction was at 16 Cancer in water. Then we have the cholera pandemic, which occurred, the pre-conjunction occurred on 1802, and that was at 5 Virgo. The Spanish flu, the conjunction, it happened in the conjunction at 14 Capricorn. The AIDS, which I wasn't planning on looking at, but I've ended up kind of exploring that one almost more than any of the others. It's fascinating. So the AIDS conjunction, the AIDS pandemic started at the 1980-81 conjunction, which actually happened 3 times because there was retrograde motion. So we have it at 9, 8, and 5 Libra. And that one squares the 1842 third plague conjunction. And finally, we have COVID-19 that happened in 2020. Now, the actual pandemic started at the, you know, during the 20-year period of the conjunction of 2000 that happened at 22 Taurus. And I know there was a lot of talk in the last lecture about this 22, and I was immediately going, yes, and it fits into this 2000 conjunction of Saturn and Jupiter, 22 Taurus. So we would also want to look at, you know, obviously the 2020 conjunction, because it was so close to when it started. So this is what we're going to be looking at now. So before we begin looking at this, I want to just say that I'm using charts, and I hope there's not too many of them, and I hope that it's not too mind-boggling, but if it is, you can look at the recording and take note of it. But the way I kind of did this, I've done all the charts for the universal time. Well, you know, Greenwich is the time that I use, so the GMT time. Obviously, you know, if we wanted to know specifically more details, we would have to locate these charts in a particular place. Okay, so we have the Spanish flu from 1918 to 1920. Now, looking at this, remember, pandemics occur because of an imbalance in the environment. And probably I would tend to think that if World War I was not happening, then this may not never have been a pandemic. It would probably have been a bad flu. Many people would still have died, but it would not have been this worldwide pandemic, because it actually began at Fort Riley in Kansas, and it was some soldiers that had it, and they ended up, getting on a train, traveling down to New Orleans, hopping on a boat and going off to Europe to fight World War I. And they landed, I think it was in France, and then of course it spread, this flu everywhere. And it's referred to as the Spanish flu because the Spanish were not involved in the war, but it came to their shores and they started to go, hey, there's all these people dying and they're dying horrible deaths. They were basically like, starting off like a normal flu, bit of a sore throat, bit of a fever, and then suddenly it would hit their lungs, and within 24 hours, a lot of them would die. And basically it was almost like they were drowning in their own, the fluids in their lungs. So it was a horrible, horrible thing, and very quick. People would die very quickly, and it was quite a scary thing. So a few other stuff happened, and that is that, the powers that be tried to downplay it. So we have a bit of the propaganda that came in and actually probably made the whole thing worse. And if that sounds familiar, it sounds familiar to me. So this is the pre-Spanish flu conjunction of Saturn and Jupiter. And the way I got this chart was I basically animated my software until I got the exact moment when these two came to perfection. So looking at the ascendant descendant, it's not that important. What we really want to see is the connection between the planets in these charts. So we've got an opposition from the moon in this chart. The actual conjunction degree is 13 degrees, 58 minutes. There's also an antisha with Uranus, which I found kind of interesting. There's something hidden and unexpected that is connected to this particular chart. Saturn is opposite Neptune, and we have Pluto opposite Uranus. But more importantly, that Pluto, and here are the important conjunctions of all the plagues, that Pluto is pretty much on the 1325 conjunction degree, as well as pretty close to the 531 conjunction degree. Now remember, Jupiter's in fall in Capricorn. So, this is an interesting chart to look at. And there was also this triple conjunction of the three, baddies at 17, 15, and 15 Capricorn, which happened a couple weeks after the actual conjunction of Saturn and Jupiter. Now, the first reported case was March 11th, 1918. And within 4 months, the virus had made its way around the globe and returned once more to the US shores. One of the things about pandemics is that they're very quick. They seem to just spread like wildfire. Now, doing the ingress chart for 1918, we would think, well, is there going to be something in this chart that is going to be a hint about what is about to come? Now, we know that much of the world was already at war, and it was a pretty horrific war. So in this ingress chart, we have actually an interesting thing. Venus is at 18 degrees of Aquarius, which is the 1345 conjunction degree. We've got a few things happening, but most of them are either sextiles or trines. It's like there's an easy kind of thing happening. This is the waning sextile of the 1901 conjunction. So we're coming to the end of that time period. And so Jupiter is waning, it is in a waning sextile to Saturn. We've got Saturn conjunct Neptune. Now, there's a lot of things that could be said about the Saturn conjunct Neptune. And because I'm only focusing on the Saturn-Jupiter conjunction, I'm letting some of those things go. I'm just noting them. We've got we've got an exact partile sextile between the moon and Mars. I'm very much one of these people that I like to see things like partile aspects exact, because then I know this is an active one. So we can look at this chart and we can say, wow, this is pretty, this is pretty interesting. Yeah, maybe it might show. I mean, does it show disease? I'm not sure. Maybe that Neptune Saturn could, there's a few things. But what we really need to do is we need to put it on top of the conjunction chart. So this is the conjunction chart back here, and this is the Aries ingress. Now, if we had a location and we wanted to see how this would, plug in, it would have different angles. I'm not going to focus on the angles because this is just done for the GMT time. It's just so that we have something to look at. But now we're having some really interesting connections. So the C up here means the conjunction. So the conjunction Sun is in a partile opposition to the ingress Jupiter, which is at 5 degrees of. So there's the Sun. Where is it? The Sun is here at 5 Sagittarius, and it is opposite the ingress Jupiter. Exactly. I like this. This means something to me. It is also making a trine both to wait a second, where is it? It's making a trine to the actual Sun of the ingress and as well to the Saturn and Neptune conjunction of the ingress chart. It is also making, I already said that, it's making a trine to the Sun. The conjunction Saturn is in a partile opposition to Pluto. And then we've got a bunch of other stuff. So when we start to look at these charts and we start to see how they interact with each other, it's like, well, yeah, whatever this conjunction of 1901 was about, it is really it's highlighting this ingress chart of 1918. So I found that to be really quite interesting. Now, there were more deadly outbreaks of influenza during the 20th century. All of them happened at the Earth conjunction period. And the Asian flu of 1957 would have occurred at the pre-conjunction at 1940-41, which was a triple one where you had it arriving, happening 3 times. So this takes us to AIDS and COVID. And this is where I want to spend a bit more time because this is bringing us into the future. Where are we going from here? Now, why am I putting both of these up? Because they occur during the mutation from Earth to air. And this is an interesting period to look at. So COVID was identified in 2019. It unfolded during the year of 2020. When the last Saturn-Jupiter conjunction occurred. And I've only put this photograph in because it was such a beautiful photograph and I just needed to put it in there. It occurred, as we all know, on the solstice at 0 degrees of Aquarius. Thus, it completed the shift from Earth to air, which began 40 years previously when Jupiter and Saturn met in Libra. So let's look at that. So these are the 3 conjunctions. The 1980, the first meeting of them, the 2000 and the 2020. So in 1980, it conjunct at 9 degrees of Libra the first time, and then it retrograded back to 8 and conjunct again, and then it went forward and conjunct a final time at 5 degrees. In 2000, it just did it once at 22 Taurus, and in 2020, it did it at 0 degrees of Aquarius. Now, a couple things to note. 1980, Mars was at 0 degrees of Aquarius. So that was kind of pre-echoing the 0 degrees conjunction in 2020. So it kind of brings those two together because, of course, I noticed that Mars was often very active during pandemic times. Now, the Mars in the 2000 conjunction chart is at 17 degrees of Gemini, which of course brings us to that 1325 conjunction at 18 Gemini. and as well Uranus in that chart, which is in a trine with that Mars, is at 20 degrees Aquarius, which brings us to the 1345 conjunction. In 2020, Mars was actually at 23 Aries. And this one is really interesting because that was the 1822 conjunction, which was the last conjunction in fire before the final mutation into Earth. So it had gone into Earth and then it kind of went back into fire for one last cycle and then finally decided, okay, I'm in Earth for a while. So it's kind of interesting that it is kind of, connecting up to that. And the 1822 conjunction was actually at 24 degrees of Aries. So this is quite interesting, these connections. And this got me really interested in looking at this in more detail. So let's look at the AIDS. Now, AIDS is something that it was in 1981 when it really became known. So we have three conjunctions, like I said, that occurred. The first one on the 31st of December, 1980, the second one in March, 1981, and the final one in July 24th, 1981. So one thing to remember, this first conjunction is the first time that Saturn and Jupiter conjunct in air since 1405, when they met at 23 degrees of Aquarius. So it's been a long time coming, and now it's back in air. So we'll look at these in a little bit more detail. So the first one we can look at and say, well, there's a couple things going on. The moon and Mars are squaring each other, and Mars is receiving the moon. Okay. Also, we've got Sun, Mercury making a square to the conjunction degree of 9 degrees Libra. But more importantly, that Sun Mercury conjunction is on the 1842 conjunction degree. And the 1842 was the pre-conjunction before the third plague. So interesting. On we go to the second one. The second one, we now have, also here, the most interesting thing about this one is the fact that we have Uranus, who's just gone into Sagittarius and is stationing, about to go retrograde. And it is being squared by Venus. Venus at 5 degrees of Pisces is actually on the opposite of the 1802, which was the pre-cholera pandemic conjunction, which occurred at 5 Virgo. Let me see, what else do we have? We've also got Mars making a square to Neptune. And so we've got, a number of things here. And the final one was the third one. And the first cases of AIDS started to be reported in June of 1981. So we know that this was July 81. And here we've got a few more things. We've got an opposition from the moon to, wait a minute, I think I've drawn it wrong. No, it is there, to moon and Pluto. And we've got Venus making a square to that Pluto. The moon is also trining both Venus and Neptune. And we've got a square from Mars to the conjunction degree. Now, I just want to make sure, is there any comments or questions that I'm missing? Please let me know.
There's quite a lot. So why don't we'll go back a little bit and see if there's anything that are worth. We're going to be going back before some of the AIDS discussion, but I think that's okay.
That's okay.
Yeah, so Liz says that she's read that the actual cause of death for the Spanish flu occurred from pneumonia exacerbated by the housing of the ill in great warehouses. To which Lee responded that there's some very interesting information on that. It's pretty complicated in the US, not clear whether this has even actually occurred through military camps that were forming in the US or not. I don't know if you have any thoughts or comments on that.
Yeah, look, I mean, I did so much reading on it, and I just basically, I had to sort of, kind of go with what, was the most commonly reported things. A bit like the Black Plague. There's like I read this 50-page article on the plague. It was fascinating. And basically, now a lot of people are thinking there was like an Ebola type virus that might have been responsible for a lot of what, people, so there's a lot of things. And I'm basically just starting a beginning point to look at this, and it's far from being totally, I mean, if I was going to get into it, I would just spend hours and hours talking about it. But yeah, there are lots of controversies. I've also read that the so-called Spanish flu did not emanate from the US, but from somewhere else, and I can't remember now. But most of the things I seem to read is that it started in the US. I also would say that like pandemics occur when there's an imbalance, and living in these great big, like soldiers do, and they're being housed in these kind of big sort of warehouse kind of housing, it's probably not a balanced way to live. And so it probably exasperated the, I said that word wrong, exasperated the catching of all these diseases.
Scott says, this is so well researched and fascinating. Do you look at declination when you're doing this kind of modeling?
I haven't, because that's another thing I could do, but I haven't. So yeah. Oh boy, that's another. Okay, all right, I've got my work cut out for me.
So there's a comment, this one's from me, Eve, that the AIDS examples you're showing are helpful illustrations of how air signs point to the blood, and how Saturn Jupiter conjunctions in air connect with bloodborne illnesses, like the plague.
Yeah.
And then of course this conjunction was in Venus's sign, connecting in with what is effectively a sexually transmitted infection.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So there's definitely all that kind of stuff, which is fascinating. I mean, look, there's a lot here, and there's a lot symbolically that we can gain from this. But I think what I find really interesting as well is the way these degrees of where the conjunctions occur will kind of reappear. And you think, it's just one way of dealing, I guess, or of looking at these charts. Yeah. Now,
I think you're ready. You're good to go now, I think.
Okay. All right. So we've looked at these three charts, and what we really need to do is look at the ingress chart. Now, of course, again, I've just done this for GMT time. It's not, we could do this for a particular location. And interestingly, the AIDS epidemic, the ingress chart was, again, we have that conjunction. Here it's not perfected, but it's at 6 degrees. It is, we can say AIDS began at the very beginning of the air conjunctions. It is for the next 20 years, but it's also the first for the next, the next mutation, so it is a really interesting thing that this is when AIDS started. Looking at this chart, we can see that it was on a full moon. Mars is included in there, so that moon is making an opposition to that Mars. We've got also Uranus at 0 degrees of Sagittarius, just going retrograde, but right on that 0 degrees, 0 minutes. So a lot of zeros. We've got a number of interesting squares. Mercury is squaring Uranus. Mercury's at 2 degrees, and Venus is making a square to Neptune. And of course, all of these partile aspects between these 0 degree planets are very interesting. But what's really interesting is to look at that ingress chart on the foundation of the pre-AIDS conjunction. So the first one, I mean, there's not going to be that much difference because it only happened, a few months before the ingress. We can see, of course, in that chart that we had a 0 degrees Mars in Aquarius. So that's going to be plugging into all those 0 degrees in the ingress chart. And in the pre-conjunction, we have actually Uranus at 28 of Scorpio. So he is trining that Venus. So that brings in this idea of, you know, again, sexually transmitted disease. I think Venus is also, you know, exalted in Pisces. So really interesting. The second one, I didn't really see much, so I'm just going to skip over it because there's a lot to get through. But the third one I found really interesting, the final conjunction. This one seemed to really plug in a lot. We have a lot of, I didn't mark all of them as partile, but there are quite a number of things that are happening. Of course, we've got the conjunction already on top of it. We've got the conjunction degree that is making a sextile to Uranus in the ingress chart. We've got that Mars squaring the conjunction, the Saturn, Jupiter in the ingress chart, as well as the moon. And of course, it's going to be squaring the Mars and the sun in the ingress chart. It's also making a very close trine to Mercury. And we've got the moon also trining Neptune and opposing Pluto. So there's a lot happening here that is really kind of highlighting this conjunction, this pre-AIDS conjunction, so to speak. So this was the final conjunction, and it was really going haywire. Now, interestingly, when I started to research AIDS, I found that in 1986, that was the year when a lot of the governments, or particularly the American government, I think, but a lot of the governments started to put these real, you know, like you're not allowed to travel, you can't work in certain places if you're HIV positive. There was this huge, like, it was kind of bad. And the death rates were rising. Now, they didn't get to their peak in 86, but they were really moving up at this point, and people were freaking out about it. And this was when Saturn and Jupiter were in their waxing square. So the ingress chart here, very quickly, you've got Saturn, Jupiter square. So there's Saturn, and Jupiter is at 6 degrees of Pisces. Saturn is at 9 Sagittarius. You've got Uranus conjunct Mars. There's Uranus at 22 Sagittarius, Mars is at 26. A bit wide, but it's still a conjunction. And Uranus is in a partile square to Mercury. Where is Mercury? Mercury's here at 22 Gemini. All these 22s, they keep coming up. 22 degrees. It's interesting. And to me, that, you know, really was like that fear and that communication of, oh, you know, there's this thing and it's going to kill us all, and, you know, the devil is here, and we can't allow anyone who's got AIDS to be anywhere near anyone because, you know, you can catch it from sitting on the same toilet seat. And it was kind of crazy. And look at this, the moon in the conjunction chart is exactly on the same degree as where Pluto has come in the ingress chart for 1986. I found that fascinating. I went, oh my God, you know, I know it's not a transit but it's kind of like you're laying it on top. So I found that really fascinating. And of course, the Pluto in the conjunction chart is exactly square, partile square to the moon in the ingress chart. Again, you know, you can't make this stuff up. You've got the actual degree of the conjunction. I'm only using the first conjunction here. It is exactly sextile to the degree partile Saturn. And it is also, what is it? No, it wasn't. Sorry, it wasn't doing that. Pluto, yeah. So Pluto is also making a sextile to that Uranus and Mars. And we've got one more thing. We've got Neptune squaring the Mercury. So there's a lot going on here. And I found that really interesting. Now, are there any comments or questions that I need to address?
Yeah, I think
'Cause-
there's two that you might want to hear. Sheila says that earlier cases of HIV have been identified going back to 1959, but it didn't become a pandemic with easy transmission until 81. So what you're really picking up on here with these charts is that the issue of transmission radically changed, and you can kind of
yeah.
see
And
the
Sheila, I will tell you that I looked up the 1940-41 conjunctions, and I did look at that, but I had to kind of place that out. I had to that was one of the things that I had to call out of this, because I knew I wouldn't have time to get through it all. But yeah, that is fascinating. And when you start to look at that, and you look at those 1940-41, there are 3 conjunctions. Yeah, it gets really, really interesting at that point. So, but you know, it is interesting that back then those conjunctions were occurring in Earth, much slower. Earth is cold and dry, whereas these were happening in air. So you can see how that, you know, I think air is like where things seem to transmit quickly. Now, of course, you know, these aren't static. That's why I mean it's like this underlay for the time period, but there's lots of stuff going on top of it. But that underlay is there. So that air underlay is kind of creating the environment in which something is much more communicable than it would be in the earth element, where it's communicable in a different way. It has to, you know, anyway, I don't know. It's just interesting. Okay. So any other comments,
one
questions?
comment from Joanna. Joanna says, so lovely to hear Eve speak again, always so clear. This is an absolutely fascinating subject that interests me greatly. I mean, in a very general way, Jupiter and Saturn equals big problem. I often wonder about the predisposition, quote unquote, that is seeded by the energy of the pre-event conjunctions, much like the resulting physical effects on humans of the 18 months of darkness that was experienced in antiquity. At the time, there were 18 months where the earth got covered in darkness as a result of a volcanic eruption in Iceland. That's what researchers probably caused it. Anyway, so that comes from Joanna.
Yeah, thanks, Joanna. That's very nice of you. Yeah, look, it is fascinating. And like I said, you know, I for me, researching this, I was just like, I mean, I would spend days and I'd come out of my room and I go, okay, I've gone down these rabbit holes. I've learned so much. I don't know if I can use any of this information. It's too much. I've got to sort of cut it down. But yeah, pretty interesting. So one of the reasons I'm going through these Saturn, Jupiter like squares and things like that is to show you how you've got this chart, this moment when these 2 planets come together. That's what we work with as astrologers. But this moment is the beginning of a time period. And then we can look at that time period, and then there'll be things that will, you know, trigger that time period, usually like critical days in medical astrology, where you're looking at, you know, the squares and oppositions, and then the waning squares. I mean, we can look at other things. Andre Barbeau looks at all sorts of different, you know, aspects of the planets, the big, you know, outer planetary conjunctions, and then, you know, looks at the whole cycle in that way. And we could definitely do this here, but yeah, I don't have time to go through it all. But there is one more we can look at, and that is the waning square. So in 1995, oh, sorry, are there any other questions or comments that need to be addressed?
Only one that I think Mari says that Mars in Cancer hits the Jupiter-Saturn conjunction in Libra. That happens in July 1981, which is when AIDS hits the news, and it's called a gay cancer at that time. And
Yeah,
so
yeah.
Mari just said, great talk. She's enjoying this. So
Yeah, thanks, Mari. Yeah, I did see that, but I was going to add up this whole other thing about eclipses and everything, but you know, there was only so much time. And I did that Mars Saturn conjunction in Cancer is a fascinating cycle as well, which I did start looking at, but I had to cut it down. But here in 1995, this was probably the year when there were the most deaths, because in 1996, they started to create certain medicines or ways of treating it, and it started to reduce the amount of deaths that were occurring. So this was kind of like, from what I could see, the peak of the fatality in AIDS people are still dying of it. I mean, it's not over. And I think this is something, we in the West think, oh, AIDS, we've got, stuff we can take and we can control it. And yeah, we're lucky. There are people living with HIV and have been living, normal lives because of the medication they can get. However, we should never forget that there are many places in the world where that is not the case, and people are still dying in droves of AIDS-related infections, because basically it's the HIV virus that they have. So we should never forget that. It's not over. But at least in the Western world and in our Zeitgeist of us Westerners, this seemed to be the pinnacle of the deaths and destruction of AIDS. And after 96, it was a little bit more treatable, and it started to become more and more, I mean, it was still the thing. And politically, it wasn't until early 2000s that they started to remove these restrictions of people, working in certain places and whatnot, being HIV. It was no longer, I don't know, it was almost like, for a while, if you had HIV, you were like a leper, or you were treated that way. So looking at this ingress chart, look at this. We've got the moon, the 6 degrees of Scorpio for the first conjunction, and there we have the North Node at 6 degrees of Scorpio. Oh, I love astrology. And we've also got the nodes right on the Mars of this chart. And in this one, what's interesting is how Venus is plugging into a lot of things. So Venus at 16 degrees of Sagittarius is trining Mars, and it's squaring that Jupiter, sorry, I beg your pardon, that Saturn at 16 degrees. So it's a partile square to Saturn. And we've got Venus on top of conjunct the Jupiter. So for me, that's a really interesting thing where, it seems in a way friendlier than the last one. It's almost like there's this, Venus is coming in and, bringing things together in a bit of a nicer way. I mean, we still have this Mars, but he's sextiling things. He's sextiling both that Pluto and the Sun, which themselves are in a in a trine to each other. And, Mars is kind of sextiling them, each of them. So it's a little bit friendlier, but it is really interesting to me how these charts start to, plug into each other. I did have this idea of, when you're looking at a time period, you're looking at different time periods that kind of interlock. And this idea of interlocking and seeing certain degrees just popping up, I found really fascinating. Are there any comments or questions about this or anything?
No comment at the moment.
Okay, all right. So let's go on to COVID, because, hey, we need to do this. So COVID happened the year of 2020, and this is the conjunction chart for 2020. Interesting thing, we have Neptune at 18 Pisces, which is actually very close to the 1504, which is the only pandemic that had a conjunction in water sign, which I'd like to explore that a bit more, but I didn't have time to. We've also got the nodes at 19 Gemini. Okay, lots of squares here. We've got the square between Mars and Pluto, which is a partile square. We have the square to the nodes from Neptune. And yeah, so that's about it. So let's continue on, because really this is the conjunction at which at which COVID started. It began in this period of time. It was already happening in 2020. So we really should be looking at the 2000 conjunction. And this one brings us to that all wonderful 22 Taurus, which we can plug into Mari's charts and everything she was talking about. Very fascinating. So here we have Mars at 17 Gemini. Okay, we're back to the 13, 25, and even the 5, 31 conjunctions. It is exactly opposite, not exactly, I beg your pardon, it's opposite Pluto. It's a bit wide, but there's an opposition. Mars is also trining Uranus, and Uranus at 20 Aquarius is on the 1345 conjunction point. Saturn and Jupiter are at 22, and they are squaring Uranus pretty closely. And we have the Sun conjunct Venus. Venus particularly is trining the Moon. We can bring in the Sun there as well. I'm sorry, it's not trining. I beg your pardon. What am I looking at here? The Moon is in Aries, and that's a sextile. Beg your pardon. And then we've got Moon. Venus is trining Neptune. Okay, so we've got all this, but what we really want to see is how does this, this is like the imprimatura of this time period, and how does this, oh, sorry, there was also the ingress chart. This is the ingress chart for 2020. So let's just look at that before we put them on top of each other. So we have that ingress chart, and here we have a conjunction of Mars and Saturn at 22. Don't we love that 22 degrees? 22 degrees of Capricorn. We have a bit of a stellium in Capricorn because we've also got Pluto, and we've got Saturn all in Capricorn within orb of each other. So we've also got this Mars Jupiter is in a partile trine to the 2000 conjunction, which was at 22 Taurus. We have the Moon squaring Venus, and we've got Uranus making a trine to the south node and a sextile to the north node. But what's really interesting is when you put them together. And so when I first put them together, I looked at it and I went, well, the interesting thing is, of course, we've got the south node sitting on this sort of stellium. And I thought about what that might mean, the south node. I mean, it is something that is very debilitating. It's kind of, I do know, in the wonderful words of a particular teacher of mine, it's like the toilet. And so everything is just kind of being flushed down the toilet here. It's a real sense of a lack of energy. And if we think about, in many ways, the 2020, 2021 period of time, really did feel like we were being drained with all the lockdowns and whatnot. So it's interesting. We do have a bunch of other stuff happening. We have Pluto, which is sextiling the Moon in the ingress chart. We have the conjunction degree, which is, of course, making an exact trine to this Mars Jupiter. We have the Moon, which is making a square to, sorry, we've got Mars making a square, to Neptune. We've got Venus, which is squaring Mercury. I think that's kind of what I kind of saw there. A lot of stuff happening. And so this is the 2020 ingress with the 2020 chart. Now, here, you're not going to see as much because, again, a lot of these outer planetary things are going to be the same. They're not going to change much. But we do have Neptune exactly in a tight sextile with that Mars Jupiter, and we have a square from Mars to that degree, to that 22 degree. So, this is reasonably, there's quite a bit going on there. But what I really want to focus on, if I have time, is there any, do I still have time? I have no idea. How am I doing for time? Wade? Hello?
Yep, you're doing pretty well. You've got about another
11, 12 minutes.
Okay, good. Are there any questions or comments or anything?
Yep, there are a few. Richard Edlund, this is the one that I would read. Richard Edlund would call the 2000 conjunction a retrogression of the conjunction, which is a transitional arrangement where the new theme of the mutation has been stated once, and then the series retrogrades back, transition, but also out of time, and that it's really like a battle between the element of the old mutation and the new one. So that comment comes to us from Lee.
Yeah, thank you for that. I mean, that's a really interesting thing to think about. And certainly I do think there's a lot to be said for that. There is this sense of, we're not quite here, but we're not quite there yet. Can I just go on? Is there anything else anybody wants to comment on?
I think at the moment you're good to go. No other comments have come in.
Okay, so this is the chart that actually inspired all of this for me. It was a chart I call it COVID identified. It was a chart which appeared in Astrology and Medicine newsletter of the Astrological Association. And it accompanied an article called A Modern Decumbiture COVID-19 by Leanne McGafferty. So thank you, Leanne. And she used this chart and just kind of analyzed it as a decumbiture. I sort of looked at this chart and thought, well, this is like the birth of COVID. This is like when it was baptized, when it was named, it was identified. So I think this is a really powerful chart. When we talk about moments, this is a chart of a moment. This is a moment that is really important. We identified this virus that has gone on to kill millions of people throughout the world, and which will probably continue killing people for a while. So I thought it was really interesting to look at this chart. And of course, we have this conjunction, which, this was identified on December 30th, which is not long after the ingress and not long after, so we've got this 22 Capricorn, which happened not long after this. The moon is in a partile square to Mars, and I'm sure that our American friends will recognize that moon degree of 27 Aquarius. It is the moon on the Sibley US chart. We've got Mercury trining Uranus, and pretty closely, within a degree. We have, of course, the Mars Pluto is on the 2000 conjunction. We've got the sun exactly conjunct the South Node, and it is on the 1842 conjunction degree. And we have Neptune, which is actually trining again this 1504 the cholera. The smallpox, pre-smallpox pandemic degree. So there's a lot of really interesting connections there. And then, let me see. When we put that chart on top of the Saturn Jupiter 2000 conjunction, look at this. We get all of these trines and sextiles. There's, it's all this easy kind of, whatever this COVID was, it was going to happen easily. It was in this environment where it was like, I'm going to just come in and do my thing. There's a lot of partile connections. The moon is in a partile trine to Mercury. We have the conjunction Mercury is in a partile trine to the moon. So we have this Mercury moon thing going on, which I find really interesting, because moon and Mercury are both about the mind. And I think a lot of this disease, in many ways, yes, it affected the body, but I think it also affected how we think of our world, how we deal with our world, how we feel about it. So I think there was a lot of mind stuff going on as well. And they do say that there was a lot of mental, or some claim that there was a lot of mental illness that came out of the COVID. So it wasn't just this virus that was attacking the body. There was also what it was doing to our society and how we were coping with it from a mental perspective, and that can be quite interesting. We've got, of course, the partile, the conjunction degree, trining the Saturn and Pluto conjunction. So quite a number of things which I found really fascinating. Now, moving forward, the next one will be in 2040, and it will be at 17 Libra, which is an interesting one because that is making a trine to the 531, the 1325, and the 1345 conjunctions. I mean, it's within 2 degrees. I mean, this is actually 17, but it's really almost 18, 1755. So I'm like, oh, okay, that's going to be interesting. What could that mean? I mean, could be a bit scary, but maybe we should prepare ourselves. The other thing that's happening is in that is we've also got Mars at 21. And why did I? Oh yeah, that's opposite the 2000 conjunction. Okay, so we've got a number of things happening here. We've got Venus in a partile sextile with the conjunction. We've got the Sun, a partile square with Uranus. We've got Pluto squaring the nodes, partile. We've got Mercury trining Pluto. We've got Mars conjunct the South Node and trining, squaring Pluto, and finally the Moon trining Venus. So there's a lot happening there. But what if we put COVID on top of it? What happens? Well, suddenly we're getting a lot more resistance, we're getting some more oppositions, and we're getting a few squares. So I would tend to think that if we're getting oppositions and squares, there's a little bit more resistance. So maybe COVID, if it comes back or if it keeps going, it might not be as, we're not going to be faced with the kind of lockdowns and freakouts that we have been. I did add here, because they are exact to the degree, these inconjuncts with Uranus in the 2014 is, an exact inconjunct to that 8 degrees where the Sun and South Node are. And remember, that's also on the degree of the 1840, whatever it was, can't remember now, 1841, I think it was, degree. We've also got the 17-degree conjunction, which is in conjunct with Neptune. The Moon is exactly opposite that Neptune. And we've also got the conjunction of Pluto that's going to come and conjunct that Moon. So there's a few things happening, and my view is that, we're not out of the woods yet, but I do believe that we'll probably be in a slightly better shape to deal with it than we were the first time, when I think it just kind of, just very naturally just slid into things and off we went. Yeah, so I think that kind of brings me roughly to the end of where I want it to be. I don't think there's anything else. Yep, that's it. There's nothing else. So any questions or comments or anything that anybody wants to add? Or I know there's so much that I would love to be able to explore more, but I knew I've only had a certain amount of time. So I had to.
That's right. Cindy says that there's been a recent surge in COVID cases lately, and just wanted to contribute that to your thoughts.
Okay. All right. Yep. And look, one of the things about COVID, and like I said, I think that, this is where the Jupiter, that over exuberant, puffy air Jupiter that's excessing in all of his opinions. You see this, like, when you read about like the Black Death and the Justinian plague, there were rumors, and of course there were, all sorts of things were going around. It's not new. It's just that we have an internet, so it happens much quicker in some ways. But there is this thing that it's not just the disease. One of the comments I keep hearing or have heard over the years, and not to get into the controversy of vaccine or not vaccine or whatever, but people have said, well, I just don't want to be told what to do. And to me, that is like, yeah, Saturn wants to keep you safe, but Jupiter says, I don't care. I want to, I believe that I'm in charge and I can do what I like. So, I mean, there's a certain, I think that kind of dilemma really was highlighted with the COVID. There was this push, and maybe somebody did make that comment about, the Earth conjunction that COVID happened in, but going into air. So it's kind of like, yeah, there's this reality check, this manifested thing of, hey, we've got to deal with this and do it in an earthy way. And then there's that air stuff. Oh, but if I believe this and, you can't, and there's all these rumors and propagandas and this and that. And, we get into conspiracy theories and everybody has an opinion, but not very many people have knowledge of it. So, and to me, that's a Jupiter in bad shape. It's a lot of opinion, little knowledge. So, yeah, North Node on Algol. I just saw that. Thank you. Okay. Oh yes, it'll be in 2040. It will be. Yes, that's another thing to look out for. Oh, maybe it'll be a bit. I mean, look, as far as the health thing is concerned, I think that, it seems like whenever we enter air conjunctions, there tends to be some sort of a pandemic. Or plague, and they do kind of go up and down, just like the Justinian plague. You had the first 3-4 years, a lot of people died, then it seemed to die back, and then it would come up again 8 to 12 years later. So we're probably on that as well.
Wonderful. You have so many lovely comments in the chat. We'll make sure you get a copy of that, Eve. Just want to say thank you so much for a well-researched presentation. It was very well received. Yeah, everybody join me in thanking Eve for her contribution. Wonderful. I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording now.